So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Firth-Butterfield, and I'm head of AI and machine learning at the World Economic Forum. And what we want to talk about today is rethinking the regulator of the future. We are all told that innovation is stifled by regulation. So that's a question that I'm immediately going to be asking of our guest today, who I first will ask to introduce himself and a little bit about his background and the regulatory powers that you have at the moment.
Thank you very much, Kay. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I head an organization which is a multi-sector regulator. It regulates telecoms, transportation, electricity, water, basically all utilities in one shop. And my background is in technology itself, electronic and computer engineering background. And I spent 7 years working on development of technology within the government of Rwanda before I moved on to become a regulator. So I came to the regulatory authority with a background of having worked with a lot of innovators and doing a lot of work in terms of e-government as well as the innovation space.
Super. So when we were having the discussion in preparation for this meeting, you told me that Rwanda's a startup country. Can you just talk to our audience a little bit about what you mean by that?
So Rwanda, in many respects, is a startup country. Back in 1994, we had tragic events that led to a genocide in Rwanda. And everything went back to a reset, practically speaking. About 1 million people dead, a lot of infrastructure destroyed. And out of all of this, the country had to reinvent itself. And that's why I say we're a startup nation, because literally everything went back to reset and we started from scratch. Now, the beauty with that is that you do not deal with a lot of legacy. You tackle a problem as it is and you find solutions for the present and for the future, without being held back by legacy thinking and mentality.
Thank you. So you've described how you're a regulator across a lot of different sectors. And I wonder, often regulators just regulate one thing. What would you say is the benefit of being able to regulate a number of different things? And how has that enabled you to actually come into regulating some of this emerging tech space?
The advantage of having different utilities or different sectors under one regulator is it removes the silo mentality. You quickly realize that while solving a problem in transportation, you can borrow ideas from the energy sector, you can borrow from the telecom space. So having a single regulatory authority in fact, brings the kind of mentality that you have in companies that are trying to innovate and trying to, cross-fertilize ideas and across disciplines to try and come up with solutions. So being a multi-sector regulator not only brings this multidisciplinary thinking, it also brings a lot of efficiency. For example, if you are trying to deal with technology within the transportation sector, you have people who understand transport, you also have people who understand technology. So you build synergies across the board.
And so with that in mind, I think in 2016, you had a pivot in the way that you were thinking about regulation, and I wonder whether you could share that with us.
Yeah, so I joined this organization in July 2014, so it's almost now 4 years actually, next month. And within 1 year, 1.5 into the job, I quickly realized that as regulators, we tend to think in a traditional sense. So we're trying to deal with today's problems, but with the mentality of yesterday, with the mentality of the last century. And so we created a whole new department that did not exist before, that is dealing with emerging technologies. So this was a totally different department, separated from the people who have been dealing with regulation from a traditional sense. In telecom, for example, you're dealing with quality of service issues and spectrum and so on and so forth. So this was a completely different department with a totally different mentality. In fact, even the people we're recruiting are people that we typically find in innovative companies, the kind of people that will be recruited in companies that are building new stuff and trying to disrupt industry. So these are the kind of people that we actually recruited into this new department so they can help us make sense of all the emerging technologies, and as a regulator to see how do we actually foster innovation as opposed to stifling innovation.
And so how does that work in practice? So instead of getting in the way of an innovation, you're fostering innovations. So explain how that works for us.
Absolutely. So basically, we approach it from a completely open-minded standpoint, and we get all kinds of requests. For example, we get a startup company that is building something and they're wondering whether they are going to be breaking any laws or whether they need any authorizations or whether there are certain things that they need to be thinking about to make sure that they do not get difficulties down the road. So we basically, like an open door policy with anybody coming in, either to seek guidance in terms of the legal, policy, and regulatory environment, or even within what they're trying to build, whether as a regulator we have any open advice to give them. So that is on the one extreme end. Then there will be things that actually require authorizations, depending on what they are, the potential impact they have on the society and on the country. And so we deal with a wide range of issues, all within the emerging technologies, and we approach it with an open mind. And in some of the cases, we even interface with other regulatory authorities when the need arises, so that together we see how to support and foster innovation.
And so you're doing everything from helping startups to understand what they can do and what they can't do. So that's helping them to innovate in a productive way, yes. Through to licensing and I think certification as well. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. So we do everything from just simply advice and encouraging startup companies that are trying to innovate, all the way to licensing and certification or authorizations, depending on what it is. And again, this has been like an experiment as we evolve, because we're dealing with a space that in many countries regulators stay away from it, or they put a stop to it, or this kind of approach. So we've basically tried to disrupt ourselves as a regulator to say, how would a regulator of the future look like? How would a regulator within the AI era operate, as opposed to a regulator of back in the days from the telegraph to the telecommunication and up until today? So basically, disrupting ourselves and approaching something with no hard defined rules, just broad guidelines, and then we become partners with innovators to make sure that what they're innovating goes to market, but also becomes useful, that does not harm society.
And so what about if you find things that you think the government should actually be making some policy about? Can you recommend policy to the government? How does that work?
Okay, so actually the law establishing RURA as a regulatory authority gives us also the mandate to do policy recommendations, as well as to recommend new laws that are needed to continue to grow the various industries which we regulate. And so as we interact with innovators, if we go down the road and we find a new policy that is required, then we make a recommendation and we work with the government to develop this new regulation. If it's a law that is needed, same thing. We interface with the government department in charge, or the ministry, and work with them to develop a new law or a new policy as may be needed. And all of this, the objective is to actually support innovation, to encourage innovation, to foster innovation, as opposed to creating roadblocks and hindrances.
And so perhaps you could give us an example of how you also work with other regulators to make sure that the regulatory space is both innovative and also protective.
Yes, so because of all these emerging technologies, some of the developments happen in spaces that are at the interface between different regulators. So for example, we had, for example, a project which was in the drone space. And some of you might not know, but Rwanda was the first country to actually license a company to do drone deliveries for medical supplies, starting with blood, at a time when many countries were staying away from it. And for such a thing to be certified by government, as a regulator operating in the tech space, we had to work with the Civil Aviation Authority, which manages and ensures safety within the airspace, so that together we can make sense of what this is, what the implications are, and how, as the public, we should deal with it. And so we were able to work together and actually make sure they get the right authorizations, and they started to do. Now they've delivered thousands of deliveries of medical supplies. We also had a case of a lot of developments within the fintech space. So within the fintech, we had a central bank that regulates financial services. And then as RURA, we're looking on technology, information and communication technology in general, and other technologies. And so we came up with a situation where there were many innovations, people coming up and developing all sorts of solutions that are operating purely within the telco environment, but delivering financial services. So they're not working with banks, and therefore the central bank has no way of actually regulating them and making sure they're doing the right thing. So we entered into an MOU between the organization I head, RURA, as well as the central bank. So we did an MOU between the two regulatory authorities, which clearly stipulated that they deal with the financial services side and we deal with the technology side. And so whenever either a new solution or a company requires licensing to offer certain services, and you know financial services are a highly regulated space. You're talking about people's money, so it has to be highly regulated. And the central bank does not have to worry about the technology because they are not technology people. They do not have the kind of expertise you need to deal with emerging technologies. So in that respect, we've been able to do a very productive partnership and be able to support innovation in this space.
And I think it's worth saying that actually the forum was involved in the drones project, and it gladdens my heart to find that now the work that you did in working out a regulatory mechanism around that is actually now in demand across the world, because you did some foundational work that no other countries had really been brave enough to do in that space.
It's been fantastic to have this partnership with the World Economic Forum. And as I said earlier, Rwanda in many respects is a startup nation, and so we do what startups do. We disrupt, we innovate, we venture into things that governments sometimes are very cautious to venture into. And that's the whole mentality of the entire government, in fact.
Super. So having set the scene of what you're doing, it sounds to me as if you feel that traditional regulations simply won't work in the AI space.
First of all, I think even the very definition of regulation itself needs to be redefined. Because every time you say regulation, people think of hard rules, they think of punitive measures, they think of... I think that needs to be completely redefined. Because in the era of AI, you cannot be thinking that way and yet still have problems to deal with in terms of making sure that this new technology is actually used for positive purposes within the society, within our countries. And so we need to completely change the mindset towards regulation and look at regulation as a way of ensuring that the innovators, the governments, and the consumers, everyone is protected. So the government has policy objectives to accomplish. The private sector innovators are trying to innovate, put products out, and of course make money. The consumers are looking for all these products, but they also need to be protected against the harm that can come. And so we need to think about regulation in those terms as a way, as the glue that puts all the pieces together and ensures that at the end of the day, the people who are innovating, who are investing, their business interests are protected and they achieve the objectives, but at the same time, that society is protected against potentially harmful uses of technology and then everybody's happy.
Super. So we're counting down to our last 3 minutes. And I wanted to pivot slightly to something that I have been recommending to lots of countries, and that is that they need their own purpose-developed AI strategy, which would include obviously thinking about what the regulator should be doing in their country. And I just wonder, I know you've spoken a little bit about the need for a Rwandan AI strategy, and perhaps you could share that with us.
Yes, so I think in many respects, AI, like any other technology, is coming to solve real problems that people have, and probably to make possible things that have been not possible in the past. That's what technology does. But if you look at each country, we have different problems, different challenges. If you are here in the UK, the sort of problems and challenges you're trying to solve may be different from the problems that we're trying to solve back in Rwanda or another country, depending on the culture, the socioeconomic level of the country, and so many other considerations. So each country needs to have its own AI strategy to make sure that this technology actually becomes useful and helps solve their specific problems. I think one of the issues that's happened in the past is where solutions are done in a few hubs in the world, let's say Silicon Valley, and then these are taken and superimposed into an environment that is completely different from what the people who created the technology were imagining and were trying to solve. So I think it starts with each country having its own strategy for AI, and then developing the right policies, and in some cases, if regulations are needed, regulations, and creating an environment that actually takes AI and brings it to bear and solve problems that real people face. At the end of the day, it's all about people.
Super. So we have 1 minute left, and I thought I might take one question, if there is a question out there. Yes, the gentleman at the back here.
Hello. Ooh, that's really loud. I'm Sam Watts from CognitionX. We talked about, you talked about regulating innovative technology. I was wondering whether you as a regulator use innovative technology yourselves in order to perform regulation.
I don't think I understand.
Are you using innovative regulation within the regulators?
Oh, absolutely.
Innovative technology.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. I told you we created a whole new department that is looking at emerging technologies. We look at it both from the perspective of the industry and where it's going, but also look inward. So for example, if we're looking at big data and we're looking at artificial intelligence, then we look at tools within even the organization itself to help us, because you cannot be regulating and talking about something that you do not understand. So the team has a lot of leeway, even to go as far as prototyping and doing things that even we use ourselves as an organization. Absolutely, yes.
Super. Thank you very much for that question. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kay.